Hi guys, I'm gonna carry on with chapter 7 and finish up with the content. In case you don't really have time to watch this video, everything that I'll cover in today's video is already in your chapter 7 handouts that I've given to you in its PUE format. All right, so this is just a video for clarification if you prefer listening to a video format. Right, so in this chapter, and in this lesson, I'm going to cover basically how did Singapore eventually achieve full internal self-government. What was the journey towards full internal self-government? And I'll answer these questions. Okay, first question, why were the locals unhappy with British rule? Okay, so what were the instances that the locals displayed their unhappiness? How did the British respond to changing attitudes? And basically what happened in the 1959 elections? Okay, so first question, why were locals unhappy with British rule? If you all remember from the last lesson, we basically covered that despite British attempts to win local support, because of internal and external developments, there was increasing anti-colonialism. More and more people were against British rule, and the British could do very little about it, right? So more and more people were beginning to demand independence from colonial rule. So we're going to explore the reasons why they were very unhappy and angry with British rule. And this unhappiness is basically expressed in 4 riots that we need to be familiar with. Okay, that will be the Maria Hertog riots, the anti-national service riots, the Hock Lee bus riots, and the Chinese middle school student riots. So we need to be familiar with the causes of all 4 riots. All right. Now, let's start with the Maria Hertog riots. And the Maria Hertog riots basically demonstrates the religious reasons, right? That some people were against British colonialism because of religion. So how did the riot happen? Basically, there was this girl called Maria Hertog, okay, and she was Dutch. And during the Japanese occupation, she was placed under the care of a Malay woman called Syed Aminah. And this Malay woman raised her in a Muslim family under the Muslim faith. After the war ended, Maria Hertog's Dutch parents wanted to then reclaim their daughter. So they came back from the Netherlands to Singapore and they wanted to take back their daughter, their biological daughter. So when they came back, initially custody was given to her foster mother, Syed Aminah. Okay, and custody means lawful parental authority. That means the law states this. So the law gave custody of Maria Hertog to her foster mother. And then within 4 days, this 13-year-old Maria was married off to a 22-year-old Malay teacher. Okay, which is something that we might be more uncomfortable with in modern context lah. So the Dutch parents used this incident as a way to reopen the case. And eventually, the court decided to transfer Maria back to her Dutch parents. So the foster mother, Syed Aminah, appealed this court decision. And the Malay press in Singapore sensationalized the issue, meaning that they blew the issue beyond its original proportions and they made it into a religious matter. So the press began to portray that Islam was being insulted by the British colonial masters and that this was a conflict between Islam and Christianity. So as a result of this sensationalization of the press, Muslim supporters became very angry. And when the court finally decided to reject Syed Aminah's appeal to return Maria Hertog to her, they rioted. Okay, and they clashed with the police, and it therefore led to the Maria Hertog riots. So basically, you need to understand that these riots were caused by a religious motivation, where Muslim supporters believed that the Islam faith was being insulted by the British. Okay, so long story cut short, in the end, Maria Hertog would return back to her Dutch parents. She would go back to the Netherlands and marry a Dutch man, and then 20 years later plot to murder him. So that's a very crazy life story of this woman. Okay, so that's the Maria Hertog riots. The second riot that we need to know is the anti-national service riots. Happened in May 1954. It involved Chinese school students. So why did it happen? Basically, the British announced the National Service Ordinance. This is an important event, okay, in which all males in Singapore between 18 and 20 must register for national service and receive military training. The reason why they did this is because, remember, there was the Malayan emergency going on at that time. They were fighting a war with the communists in the Malayan jungles. Okay, so the British were very concerned that Singapore's security might be too weak and they too might fall to the communists. So they wanted to build up Singapore's security force. So they wanted to enlist more people into this army. But the Chinese school students were very angry. And there are few reasons why they're angry. The first reason is because many of them were overaged. Many of them were already in this age range because of the war and they had missed schooling during the war. So they were angry that if they have to enlist in national service, their studies will be disrupted again. So that's like the surface reason. But a deeper reason is because, first of all, they thought that they were going to fight fellow Chinese in the Malayan emergency. Because if you all remember, the Communist Party, the Malayan Communist Party, was mostly Chinese. And so the Chinese were very uncomfortable with the fact that the British, the colonial masters, might be sending them to fight against their own brothers and sisters in the Malayan emergency. And the Chinese were unhappy because they felt like the British had always discriminated against their community and against Chinese language education. So they did not want to enlist in the army and defend a foreign government that did not even take care of them. And so these students held a protest march on 30th May 1954, which eventually led to a violent clash with the police again and with some people injured. All right, so this is the cause of the anti-national service riot. Third riot, Hotley bus riots, okay? And this is a riot that was motivated by the work conditions of workers, okay? It took place in May 1955. It involved bus drivers from the Singapore Bus Workers Union. If you all remember, a union is basically an organization that represents the rights of workers and fights for their rights. Okay, and it also involved Chinese school students again. So why did it happen? Bus drivers from this union were protesting against unfair treatment of this Hotley bus company by going on strike, meaning that they don't work, right? They just show up to work, but they don't actually drive. They just protest by not working. And so this company responded by dismissing the 230 workers who were on strike. And this made the workers even more angry. And so they protested by blocking the buses at the bus depot, preventing them from leaving. Eventually, this protest spread across Singapore, and more bus drivers joined into the strike to support their fellow workers, okay, that are protesting and fighting for better work conditions. So eventually the police had been caught and they tried dispersing the crowd with a water hose, and it led to a clash with the police, 4 dead, 31 injured. Okay, so far, let's do a tally. The Marae Hatau riots caused by religious feelings. The anti-national service riots were caused by anger on the part of the students against the British. Okay, and now the Hotley bus riots were caused by what were they perceived as unfair work conditions. Okay, and finally we have the Chinese middle school riots. This took place in September 1956. Again, involved the Chinese middle school students. So we can see that the Chinese school students actually played a pretty big role in the anti-colonial, anti-British struggle. So what happened? Basically, by this time, there was a new government in place that was led by locally elected people, which I'll mention later. This was the Labour Front government. Okay, and this Labour Front government suspected that the Chinese Student Union had been infiltrated by the communists, right? That this student union that was representing the students have now like communist secret agents that were spreading the communist ideology and trying to incite a violent rebellion in Singapore against the British colonial masters, very much like what was happening in Malaya. And so the Labour Front government ordered the student union to close. And this obviously angered the students from the Chinese high school and Chongqing High School. And so they protested by taking over their schools. They chose to sit in the schools and not leave until the union was recognized again. So you see here a picture of students. They look very old, and that's because, like what I mentioned, a lot of Chinese students had their studies disrupted during the war. So many of these students were overaged. And you can see them barricading their school against the police. Okay, because remember, they were sitting in the school as a protest against the closure of their student union. And now we recognize these schools as probably quite well-known schools, Hwa Chong Institution and Chung Ching High School. Right, these were the schools that were involved in the middle school riots. And so the chief minister of the Labour Front at the time, Lim Yew Hock, demanded that students leave or be forced out by the police. And so when the police finally arrived to the school, and the students were there was an angry mob outside that clashed with the police outside of the schools. Okay, and this violent clash led to riots spreading across the entire island. And this was the most deadly, actually, riot in Singapore before the racial riots, resulting in 13 dead and 120 injured. So these are the riots that we just went through, and these riots are really, they express and they demonstrate the extent of the anger and unhappiness towards British rule. Right, and these riots were clear indications that locals could no longer accept colonialism, and the British were on their way out sooner or later. Okay, so how did the British respond to these changing attitudes? Well, they did recognize that their time was coming up soon. And so they did allow more political power to the locals because they recognized that they couldn't hold on to the colony much longer. Remember, Britain had already lost India. By this time, it has lost its colony in Burma also. Malaya would become independent in 1955. And so Malaya did recognize that very quickly they need to give up Singapore. Okay, so they started to grant more political power to locals, but they granted it slowly and gradually. Why? Because they were afraid that Singapore would fall to communism, and they still wanted to maintain the economic ties with Singapore and the region even after they were gone. And this would not be possible if these countries became communists. All right? So how did the British grant more political power? The first instance of this is in the Randall Constitution, okay, in 1953. A constitution refers to the foundational laws of a country. So in 1953, Britain finally decided to rewrite Singapore's constitution. In this new constitution, Singapore's chief minister, or what we now know as a prime minister, will be a locally elected official instead of a British governor. And there will also be 5 local ministers elected, okay? And they'll be given control over education, health, housing, trade, and industry. The British will still maintain control over other areas like finance and like defense and internal affairs. This constitution led to the 1955 elections. These elections had more political parties involved, and the British also widened the base of eligible voters. Earlier on, the only eligible voters were British subjects. So it was a very small amount of people. But this time they increased the eligible votership, and these eligible voters were automatically registered. So more voters turned out in the elections. And in this 1955 election, like what I mentioned, the Labour Front government led by this Eurasian, David Marshall, won 10 out of 25 seats. Okay, and they won based on a message of anti-colonialism. They were very clear and adamant that when they come to power, they will do their utmost to win independence and negotiate with the British a way that Singapore will become an independent country. And so this leader of the Labour Front, David Marshall, becomes the chief minister. And this is also an example of the British granting more political power. After the elections, we have the first medical talks in 1956. Britain still wanted to do trade with Singapore after they left, but they would not be able to do it if Singapore turned communist, which is what I alluded to. Now, the British then looked at David Marshall's handling of the Hockley bus riots, which you remember happened in 1955. And they thought that David Marshall, was too weak against the communists, right? He allowed them too much power. He didn't respond quickly and harshly enough. And therefore, when David Marshall visited London in 1956 asking for full internal self-government, they refused because they were still not confident that Singapore would really not fall into communist hands. And so David Marshall, being very disappointed and feeling like he had let down the party, resigned, and he was replaced by Lim Yew Hock from the Labour Front. And Lim Yew Hock instead won the approval of the British because of his strong response against the Chinese middle school student riots in 1956. Remember that he responded very promptly, very strongly, and in the end, this made the British more willing to grant Singapore full internal self-government, which they did. Okay, they eventually allowed Singapore to control all areas, internal areas, except internal security, which is the police, external security, which is the army, and external relations, which is foreign relations with other countries. And that basically led to the final election that we will learn about in this chapter, the 1955-59 elections. Okay, this, remember, is the election for full internal self-government. It was a compulsory vote, which meant that 525,000 voters showed up. In this election, the People's Action Party sided with the trade unions, and they accused the Labour Front government of being pro-British. Okay, they basically accused Lim Yew Hock of selling out to the British and helping the British oppress their own people. So because of this campaign, a very effective campaign ran by the PAP. The Labour Front performed poorly, winning only 4 out of 51 seats, and the PAP won in a landslide victory for the 3 out of 51 seats. And so the leader of the PAP after the 1959 election becomes Singapore's first Prime Minister. And these are pictures of Lee Kuan Yew at the conclusion of the 1959 elections, speaking at the election rally and after the results were announced. All right, so this is where we leave off at chapter 7, with the People's Action Party as the first political party with full internal control of Singapore, meaning that they were able to implement policies of all areas: housing, education, finance, economy, all comes under local power. So that brings us to the end of chapter 7. And very quickly, let me just go through, in case you missed out in class, the mid-year exam breakdown. All right, so mid-year exams, there will be 2 sections. Section A will be your source-based questions. The content will come from chapter 7. There will be 3 questions: inference, purpose, and comparison. So the formats are there. Just a tip and a reminder that we want to use the inquiry question to help us when we answer things like purpose and comparison. Okay. There's a section B, the structured essay question. Okay, there are 2 compulsory SEQs, okay, and they're divided into 2 parts each. The first part is state, meaning that you can just write in point form. For example, I don't know, state 3 of the chief ministers in Singapore, for example. State 3 political parties that contested in the elections. So you just need to list them out. Okay, then part B will be your describe/explain. Describe is for NA, explain is for express. Okay, and you'll be expected to describe 2 factors relating to a certain historical event or issue. Okay, so question 2 will be on chapter 6, which is the Japanese occupation. Question 3 will be on chapter 7, Singapore's road to internal self-government. All the SEQ chapter handouts have your PU tables already. So the resources are there for you guys to study. All right. Lastly, I will be uploading a mock paper into our Microsoft Teams for all of us. So if you do finish it, we're going to turn in your completed mock paper and I'll mark it for you during the weekend. Okay, so that's it from me. All the best.